Hey guys, Scott here. My videos sometimes tend to lean towards the negative because I'm a discussion channel for games, and Dead by Daylight's my current game, and I like having discussions about things that are more controversial. I don't really want to talk about things that everyone already agrees upon because there's not much of a conversation there. That is more just kind of like a little bit of a circle jerk. So I usually tend to focus on things that are, more of a debate-worthy territory, which means I'm focusing on complaints with the game, which means it leans towards negative, and I can understand that. My Twitch stream is more just, casual, just fun, just playing the game and stuff like that. But the debates are all part of the actual commentary that I like doing for the game. But today I thought I'd do something a little different. We're going to step away from the negative and focus on all of the worst things that behavior has done for Dead by Daylight. All of the dumbest decisions that they have made. Jokes aside, I've also been working on the best decisions they've made as well. But I'm going to start with the worst decisions because I found it easier to make. So we're going to be doing a top 10, and the way I'm rating how these are placed is severity and duration averaged out. What I mean by severity is something that was so utterly broken that, it's rated based on how disruptive it was and how terrible it was and how dumb of a decision it was. Duration is how long that problem was in the game. So if we had an insanely broken thing that was only in the game for, one patch or something like that, it wouldn't score as highly as something that was super broken in the game for a very long time, and vice versa. We might have a minor complaint, but it's been in the game since the start, which could still rate high depending on the duration. So I just roughly averaged those two things out, and that's sort of how we're going to go. Number 10, which is Haddonfield. Haddonfield came out a very long time ago when Michael Myers came out, one of the first killers in the game to actually be released. It was great for the IP and all that stuff, getting a licensed character that was very iconic in the horror and slasher genre, so that was all well and good. Now, that chapter came with a bunch of problems, one of which was Haddonfield, the map. Haddonfield, over the course of DBD's entire lifespan for 9 years now, has never been okay. It has always been broken in some way in terms of balance, and about 80% of its lifespan has been severely brokenly survivor-sided, and right now it's extremely killer-sided. They have never actually balanced the map properly a single time. And the very first version was broken for like 10 different reasons. It was a combination. It was a perfect storm. One was balanced landing. Used to work differently a long time ago. There was actually no exhaustion. It just simply had a cooldown, which means you could keep running and regain your exhaustion as you're running around the houses. Additionally, even if it was on cooldown, you would still not have a stagger from the drop. So there were these 2-story buildings everywhere with 79 windows in them. You could jump out any of them, land, and you would hit the ground and run away faster than the killer could ever catch up. And so you would be in this scenario where you could just simply never catch a survivor with balanced landing on Haddonfield. It was just straight up impossible. There's nothing you could do. Even with Entity Blocker, it still did not matter because there was like 5 different windows and you could cycle through them and shuffle Entity Blocker. You just simply could not catch someone that had balanced landing on the map. That was issue number 1, and it's only perk related. Issue number 2 were the fences. There were fences on Haddonfield that were so long, they encompassed like an entire tile, meaning it would take a good 10 seconds for the killer to run around the entire thing. The problem was, if you had the killer here, the fence here, and a survivor here, you would just do this little dance for like a minute before you could catch up. And it was mind-numbing because you could just see the person on the other side of the fence, and there was nothing you could do about it unless you were like Nurse or you had it trapped as Trapper or something like that. The fences were so long that if you saw someone on the other side of one of the fences, you might as well just not chase them. There was just no point. You would throw the game trying to simply catch up with them. And it's funny because these fences still exist to this day on Bad Preschool. They forgot to remove them or something like that. Even with the remakes, they still have these giant, 80-meter long fences that encompass an entire house. And if you've seen it on Bad Preschool even recently, you'll know how stupid it is for gameplay if you're not a killer that can phase through walls. There's just simply nothing you could do about it. So the fences were another huge part of Haddonfield's massive flaws. Next were the insane amount of good windows in the map. There was the House of Pain, which is still in the game but is severely nerfed. The House of Pain had like 3 windows open, so you could enter from like any side that you really wanted and still use the same loop. Certain killers that were 110 like Huntress physically could not ever catch up with you. It was impossible. They couldn't even retain Bloodlust because you would lose chase from some of these windows, so it was a genuine infinite for 110 killers. And even for 115 killers, if you didn't hug corners perfectly, you would lose chase and they could just continue to use that structure over and over again. Additionally, at the basement in the main building, there was a ridiculously good gob window that you basically just had to vault as killer. There was no option. You could not possibly mind game going around it. There was just no way. You just simply had to vault the window, and it was right outside of the basement as well, so anyone that was in the basement just gets the easiest window escape of their life, and that was that. So it had an insane amount of god windows, an insane amount of broken fences. Balanced landing made it unplayable as killer. It was the worst map in the game for killer for a very long time. Then they did their first rework of Haddonfield, which was still really survivor-sided with one exception. They created this new disgusting 3-gen by slapping a generator right outside of the main house, one right outside of it, and one right to the left of it, or even inside the house 2 feet away. So the map was survivor-sided unless you controlled that 3-gen, then it was stupidly killer-sided. And it was extremely boring because this was around the time of the gen kick meta with Call of Brian Eruption Overcharge. The map became unwinnable for survivor in that side, but only if you played the 3-gen. If you didn't, then it was still survivor-sided and then the killer would lose. So it forced you into this super boring playstyle in order to win. Now they reworked Haddonfield again, and it's just bustedly killer-sided now. They cut off a giant portion of the map. Pretty much no good windows exist on the map anymore. There's like 2 pallets in the middle. It's a giant dead zone on the street. The gates are usually in terrible places that you can just see from both sides. The map is now insanely killer-sided. They just can't do it. They can't make Haddonfield correctly. It is always drastically sided towards one side or the other. And it just, it seems like no matter what they do, they will never get it right. So Haddonfield is number 10 for the dumbest things that they've ever done. Coming in at number 9 was one patch only, and you guys might not even remember this, but there was one patch where for some godforsaken reason, they removed all of the timing required for flashlight saves and pallet saves. What I mean by that is, if a killer picked someone up right now, there's a little bit of a timing to it. You can't just shine the flashlight immediately, even though they made it much more lenient. It's pretty hard to miss now. You still have to have some type of timing, but for some reason, completely unprompted, even though nobody asked for this, they just decided to just say, fuck it, let's just remove all of that timing entirely. So you could have someone under a pallet, the killer could look around, scan, pick up, you could drop the pallet the millisecond the animation started, run away to safety long before the killer could actually hit you and punish you for mistiming it, and then the killer would go, and then drop the person. Same thing with flashlight saves. The second it started, there was no timing required. It completely removed like 90% of the skill of Survivor is just those interactions getting the timing right, and then they just threw it out the window for one patch, completely unprompted. This was a very short duration, but the severity of the baffling decision was so high that I had to put it on this list because not a single person asked for it. Everyone hated it, and then they switched it back. They're like, oh, sorry. So coming in at number 8 is mechanic stagnation. What I mean by that is behavior has not really innovated much with the base mechanics of the game in a very, very long time. This is low on the severity, but it's been the entire game's lifespan. They really haven't done too much. The biggest real change we had was the endgame collapse, and that was a very, very long time ago. There's other minor things like the anti-face cam meter, survivor HUD, and stuff like that, but those aren't really new mechanics. They're just sort of quality of life features to the already existing mechanics in the game. They haven't done a big change in a very long time, and I think that is one of the biggest problems with the game. This is not an inherently super dumb decision just when you look at it face value, but over time, it's one of those things where it's really surprising how little they've innovated since the game came out. We're still just dudes running around pieces of wood, getting chased by killers, and jumping through windows. That's it. Those are the mechanics. Gens, pallets, and windows. That's really all we've got. They tried to introduce sort of new things, but they're through perks, like invocations, of which there's basically one worth using. There's boons, but also it's a perk. And they haven't done anything base kit. There's no like scavenge for parts or just some other new mechanic like a trial warm-up or whatever, just anything to actually make the base game, not perk related, base game feel a bit different from before. They have yet to do it, and we're coming on 9 years now, and it's still basically the exact same thing that we've been doing. And it's getting to a point where there's only so much you can do with killer powers and perks. Sometimes the game itself needs to actually change for it to feel fresh and original and new. You can't just slap on more perks, and the most insane fun killer power on the planet won't change the fact that that's the 1 out of 30-something killer, so the other games are still going to be the exact same shit that you've been doing. So I think that's one of the biggest flaws that they've had, not making any new fundamentally interesting gameplay changes from the core mechanics of the game. Again, they've done a little like minor quality of life things here and there, and the anti-face cam thing is probably the biggest thing they've done recently, but how many times have you actually used that meter? I think 1 in 100 games I get to actually Kobe off the hook because of it. So it really does not do very much at all, and killers have just been proxy camping to avoid it. So I think the game needs a new mechanic, and I think that's one of the biggest problems with Dead by Daylight. They're too scared to innovate. Coming in at number 7 is Made for This. Now, when Made for This originally came out, I didn't have that much of a problem with it, and the reason was I would just use exhaustion add-ons or perks every game to avoid it. But that sort of sells the story that it was so broken you had to do that in order to be fine. I wasn't affected by it because I was applying things that counter it, but not everybody has infinite exhaustion add-ons or perks that can actually counter it, and so the perk was wildly overtuned. For some reason, it had bonus effects with it as well. With the endurance, it was not even necessary. Just the speed boost it gave itself was completely overpowered. But it had 2 effects too, one of which is still very useful to this day, especially with We're Gonna Live Forever Made for This combo. Very good for anti-slug. But for those who don't know, the original Made for This just simply made you run 3% faster if you were injured. That's it. There's no other requirement. You didn't have to be in deep wound. You just simply ran faster for being injured. Now, 3% might not seem like a lot, but over an extended chase, it is a lot. It actually had such a profound effect on killers playing the game that to this day, it is still gaslighting killers into thinking people are cheating and they're not sure because their perception of distance has been so warped by that 3% movement speed that it's just, we're still recovering from it. And 3% faster around short loops with very tight corners that killers can't take as, tightly as survivors because of their smaller hitbox. It was a nightmare. Everybody was just simply faster. Everyone basically got an additional loop. It basically doubled the efficiency of every map based on how many additional loops you could get with that slight increase in speed. Eventually, Behavior did decide to nerf it, so it wasn't broken for an extremely long time, but it was broken for quite a while, and it was one of the most deserved nerfs that we've gotten in the game's history. So Made for This still, to this day, by the way, still an extremely good perk, and I am willing to bet if we see the rise of this slug meta, you're going to see a lot more Made for This and We're Gonna Live Forever, because those 2 perks very heavily counter that. Coming in at number 6 is Medal of Man. A lot of people don't remember the original version of this perk and how insanely busted it was. Nowadays, you have to take 3 protection hits, and then you basically get a bonus health state after doing that. But taking 3 protection hits is kind of difficult, so you would have to run in front of the killer, block an injured teammate, and get that charged up. The original Medal of Man did not require any protection hits of any kind. It just required you to simply be hit at all. So what would happen was the killer would be punished for hitting you. That's actually how stupid this perk was. The killer would just hit you, it would charge the perk, and when it was filled up, you got a bonus hit. So all it did was make these shitty M1 killers even worse, and it didn't really affect like Billy. Nurse didn't really give a shit about it. It just affected the worst M1 killers and made it even harder to win. There's not really any more complicated story to this perk. It just simply gave you a bonus health state for doing nothing other than getting hit. And I don't even need to really describe further as to why that was stupid. Later, when they added the fact that you have to charge with protection hits, it became a lot more feasible and a lot more realistic of a perk to have in the game because there was now a requirement you had to go out of your way to get, because a bonus health state is massive. That is game changing. And the fact that it just simply happened by you existing before was ridiculous. Speaking of bonus health states while having to do nothing, coming in at number 5 is the original Decisive Strike. Decisive Strike is in a great place now with the addition of conspicuous actions. You can't really do anything to progress the game forward while your Decisive Strike is still active. It's mostly used as an anti-tunnel perk now. There are a couple of exceptions, body blocking and interacting with killer powers, but they've mostly handled the perk pretty well. When this perk came out, though, and for a very long time, for years and years and years, it was really, really busted. It's had a lot of different iterations over the years, but the original Decisive Strike, back in 2016, I believe, it had no requirement at all. You just simply got to use it with doing nothing. So if the killer downed you and you had Decisive Strike, they would just get stunned for 5 seconds. Now, granted, it was once per game and everything, but everyone had a bonus life. It was literally you equipped a 1-up on everybody, unless the killer tried to slug everyone to death, which a lot of the time, that was the only option that they really had. So that was the original version, hilariously broken, even more so than Medal of Man, because it even worked against one-shots and Billy and stuff like that. You get picked up, you get to go free. It was so ridiculously broken. Then it had a bunch of different versions. Then it was like, well, you have to be hooked. And then it was like, oh, well, now you have to be hooked and you can't be getting tunneled, or you have to be getting tunneled. And you have to be hooked, getting tunneled, and that was conspicuous action. So it's gotten nerfed and nerfed and nerfed and nerfed and nerfed to the point where it's actually okay now. But yeah, the original versions, and even, not even like the version after the original version was still pretty busted. So a lot of people had to do this thing where they would have to juggle someone with Decisive Strike. And if you don't know what that is, juggling was when you pick somebody up with Decisive Strike, the skill check appears, but you could drop them before the skill check is actually used. So you could pick them up, it'd go ding, and it would show up, then you would drop them, and then you'd pick them up and drop them and keep doing this to avoid the Decisive Strike. Now, you had a limit because every time you drop them, it would fill their wiggle bar, and eventually you would just let them go entirely. So you could only do this near a hook, but it was the meta to have to just simply do this every time you picked somebody up. You would have to juggle them because they would just simply get off your shoulder for free if you did not do that. So it was an absolute nightmare. The juggling thing was so dumb, and we had to do it for years and years and years until they changed how it worked. So again, nowadays it's in a much better spot, but the original DS was the original stupid, stupid perk. Number 4, the Skull Merchant, just in general. It was one of the dumbest designs that they have ever had. And although she is more bearable to go against now, she's kind of dog shit now. So they sort of just neutered her from the game. They basically deleted her and said, we're sorry. That's how bad Skull Merchant's design was. They've effectively removed her from the game, and they did that on purpose because they can't think of anything else to do with her right now. So they just decided to just neuter her so much that she might as well not exist. That's how bad she was. The original Skull Merchant was the queen of holding 3 gens, and the only reason she's not higher on this list is because it wasn't entirely her fault. This was before we had the 3-gen protection. This was before we had the ridiculous gen kick meta, or it was during that, rather. So the whole Call of Brine Eruption Overcharge thing happened with the Chess Merchant, as she was so colloquially named, and that all just combined to this perfect storm of hour-long games, and people would just simply refuse to play against her because her gameplay was absolutely ridiculously boring, even if she wasn't 3-genning. I've made 500 videos about this. You can just Google Scott John Skull Merchant and you have a day's worth of media for you. I didn't want to put all that in this video because, again, I've already made hours worth of rants about how badly she is designed, but most people really hated her due to the 3-gen meta that she had. She could easily time lobbies out by repeatedly kicking generators with all of the aforementioned perks in the gen kick meta, and then putting drones near them, so there was an extra step which gave her extra time to regress. It was an absolute nightmare going against her, and again, even if she didn't use the 3-gen strat, the way her power was designed was so uninteresting. She would put a drone in the loop you were in, and you simply had to leave the loop or you would get hit. And it would take a little bit of a time, like it would take a while to get the hit, but sort of like kind of how Legion used to work, it would still just be a hit unless you left the loop, which was just so boring to go against. So even to this day, it's a little bit more of that, except she's a lot more outplayable now because there's only one scan line. You can actually crouch and not lose a bunch of distance due to 2 scan lines, causing you to crouch way too much, which made the killer catch up to you, which made you just get hit. Additionally, the random hinder and haste and undetectable, she had 77 different status effects that she would apply to you during a match. New players had no idea what the hell was going on. They always say that they want to make it easier for new players to understand the perks and killers that they've designed, and then they release one of the most convoluted things that they've ever done. It's completely at odds with their whole design philosophy. It made no sense. They know it's bad. They've apologized for it. Skull Merchant was an absolute train wreck, and to this day, right now, still is. And yet, coming in at number 3, Old Legion was even worse than Skull Merchant. Effectively on the game, it wasn't as bad because there was no disconnect penalty and you could just simply leave and not be forced to play against her. But the actual design of Legion was so bad that MacLeod, one of the people involved in it again, was like embarrassed by it. They said they really learned a lot from Legion. I remember him saying that like word for word. So the original Legion, if you guys were not aware, was able to down you in his power without having to hit 4 separate times. Like on the 5th hit, he can actually inflict a damaging state. No, he could just do that shit by default while still being in Frenzy. And the thing is, there was also an add-on called Frank's Mixtape, which would take away some of your deep wound bar. And if that deep wound bar was, exhausted, you would just be down. The problem was, back in the day, deep wound did not work the same way. Deep wound used to only decrease if you were not being chased. It wasn't running based before. So deep wound now, as long as you're running, it will never decrease. It's when you sit still or do something else that then it begins decreasing. But back in the day, it was tied to you being in chase, and chase mechanics have never worked properly in Dead by Daylight. So what would happen was the Legion would tag you with their power, follow you but look behind, like they would moonwalk chase you, so the chase would end and you would just start bleeding out, and there was nothing you could do about it. The killer would just chase you while not looking at you or stay relatively in the same area. You would bleed out and you wouldn't be able to finish the heal because he'd still be near you, and then you would just die. Or once the bar was low enough, he'd activate power again and smack it and remove the last bit of the mending bar. So due to the way that deep wound worked, Legions didn't actually chase you. They would get an undodgeable hit because they could just vault over pallets and windows at the same speed that you could. They would get an undodgeable hit, they would hit you, follow you for a few seconds, and you would just die. And there's nothing you could do. It was the least interactive killer they've ever made because the survivor had no options in the chase whatsoever. You had a time limit as soon as you were tagged by the power that you couldn't dodge, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. It was one of the worst things that they ever made, and I think the current Legion is a lot better. I still think they're kind of weak and they need probably a buff now, but due to the way that the power worked, due to the way that Deep Wound worked, and Frank's Mixtape, which took away a much larger chunk of the mending bar, due to the way that all 3 of these things worked, you basically would join a lobby, see a Legion, and everyone would disconnect immediately because there was no actual game to be played. Your choices or interactions as Survivor did not matter whatsoever. And because of that, yeah, everyone just refused to play against the killer entirely. So that was Old Legion. Definitely the worst killer design that they have ever had in the history of the game. Even worse than Chess Merchant, in my opinion. Now, as we get down to number 2 and number 1, these things are more systemic problems with the game. We're not talking about a specific perk. I mean, I had a top 30 list of all these, and down the list were things like Circle of Healing. There were a whole bunch of problematic things that they've done in the past, but none of them really compare to the systemic problems with the game itself. That's why as we get down to number 2, we're really talking about problems that affect everything in the real game. So, number 2, fixing problems with perks. This is a fundamental flaw of Dead by Daylight. There will be a problem with the game, camping, tunneling, slugging, gen rushing, whatever you want to say. There will be a problem, and instead of fixing that problem, they will release new content to address that. The original example of this are infinites. Infinites used to be in the game. They were infinite loops where the killer could physically never catch a survivor. There was no entity blocker. They could vault the window as many times as they wanted, and the killer could never catch up. Now, instead of fixing infinites, they eventually did years later, but instead of fixing those things, they released a killer. They band-aided it with new content. A killer called the Nurse that could just go through fucking walls. And suddenly, hey, look, infinites aren't a big deal anymore because this new thing can counter it. And that is what they've done ever since. Tunneling, here's Decisive Strike, here's Off the Record, here's Blood Rush, here's blah, blah, blah. Oh, you're getting slugged, here's Unbreakable, here's, this is what they do. They don't fix the base complaints people have with the game. They just slap band-aids on it with new content, forcing you to buy whatever is new to deal with the problem that should have been fixed by the game itself. And that has been permeating since the game has come out. Fixing problems with the game with perks and killers and powers and things like that is the absolute wrong way to go against it. And it's why a lot of people make the argument that there's a very large element of pay to win in Dead by Daylight, and it's kind of hard to argue with them because, yeah, what if you didn't have Off the Record or something like that? What if you didn't have any of these perks that you might feel is necessary to be able to survive against the way that people play the game? And having to only do that with perks and things that you have to buy or download or unlock or whatever, you don't start with, that is a problem. And I don't think it's too late to fix it. At this point, it's simply too late to fix it. There are just so many perks in the game now. They'd have to remove so many perks if they wanted to implement any of these things into the base game that it's too far gone now. It's a cancer that started in 2016, and unfortunately it's terminal now. I can't really think of any way to rectify this anymore until the game eventually dies. So this is something we're stuck with now. Problems in Dead by Daylight will only be circumvented with perks and new killers and powers and things like that, and that's it. That is one of the biggest problems in the entire game, without a doubt. Finally, I think the dumbest decision that Behavior has ever made for Dead by Daylight, some of you might have guessed this already, is skill-based matchmaking. Now, before we go any further, I'm not trying to have scrub mentality here. I don't think I should be going against people that are vastly worse than me. I don't have the problem with skill-based matchmaking in general. I think that's completely fine. The problem is Dead by Daylight doesn't have skill-based matchmaking. It has escape-based matchmaking, which is a completely different thing. They should not even call it skill-based matchmaking. Now, on Killer, it's a bit more feasible and a bit more accurate, because typically if you're killing 4 players over and over again, you're probably doing pretty good, right? But for Survivor, they have not figured out that escapes are not tied to your skill level at all. And in fact, there might even be a negative correlation where the best player on the team runs the killer the whole game, gets camped in endgame, and then dies. The game considers them to be even worse. And because of that, because it does not account for skill whatsoever, we have wildly mismatched games, so insanely different. I could go against a 4-man comp team. I'm sweating my ass off, barely hanging in there. And then the next game, I'll go against a baby Meg with 50 hours in the game. And there's just no in between, because someone might have been boosted to that point because their friends are really good and they play with their friends and their friends die for them or whatever. Like, there's just no way to account for survivor skill with the system that they're using. And there are ways to do that. The emblem system was a start. It was close to what they needed to do. They just needed to refine the emblem system. A functional emblem system with the old rank system would be the best form of the game, in my opinion. Now, they'd have to do a lot of work, and I even detailed how this would be possible. Like, you have to account for individual killer specifics. For example, what I mean, if there was an emblem to be chased by a killer, you would not rate the Wraith and, the Trapper in the same way, because the Wraith is not really chasing that much. They're going to be doing more hitting and running. They aren't chasing when you're invisible, so you can't punish the survivor for not getting chased by a killer that doesn't chase. So you'd have to have a higher multiplier on the Wraith, or like the Nurse, for example, doesn't really chase very much. So you'd have to have a higher multiplier on the survivor then you'd have to aggregate the entire total chase time in the match and assign each survivor a value based on how much of that time they took up. So that's what I'm talking about. It's a lot more complicated, but it is possible. You can do it. They just decided not to, and they went with this super shitty hockey analogy, escapes is all that matters, skill-based matchmaking system. And because of how broken that system is, the entire system is pointless. It was a giant waste of resources. It was a giant waste of time. They spent years tweaking it to the point where it still doesn't work or really do anything that it's supposed to do other than separate brand new players from basically everybody else. It's not visible, so you can't track it, so people just make up numbers in their head. They just assume they're high MMR, even though they might not be. It causes all sorts of infighting based on people making a bunch of assumptions. Hell, they should either double down or remove it. Double down and show MMR, or remove it and let us go back to what it used to be. Again, I'm not opposed to having your matches take place in an even playing field. I'm okay with that. It's just the fact that that's not what happens. That's not how the system currently works. It does not function as a skill-based matchmaking system should function. And the sad part is, even if it still did, they still prioritize queue times on top of all that, which I think is the wise decision. But even if it was perfectly accurate, it would still throw you in with random people because they don't want to have, a Dowsy waiting 50 minutes for a Twins game scenario. So that's not going to work either. So I think it was a giant waste of time, a waste of resources. The rank system was completely fine. It worked fine. They just had to make the emblem system a bit better. And instead of refining in a system that already accounted for way more than the current one does, they just said, fuck it, threw it out the window and just gave us this super piece of shit that we've got now that has caused so many just controversies and infighting and dramas, and it was just, I think, the dumbest thing they've ever done. That's it. Those are the dumbest things that Behavior has ever done in the game's history. Again, I had a whole bunch more, just some honorary mentions, just looking up, like I had like 50 of these. I mean, there's been the Gen Kick meta, Rune Undying Tinker, Blight Dodging add-on nerf, Circly Healing, Survivor volume still not being equalized, the Thrill of the Hunt buff, old RPD, DC penalties and bot replacements happening at the same time, which makes no sense. Billy Overpeat, For the People Buckle Up, Breakable Wall, like just thousands of things I could list here. I just wanted to go over the top 10 that I found to be most impactful to the game overall. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think about my list here. Next, I'll be coming out with the best things they've done, because as much as we like to make fun of them, they've also done a lot of really good things too, like the Survivor UI, for example, just things like that. So that is it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.